Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today, EU IVDR Clinical Evidence Requirements. I'm Gay Esser, the Marketing Manager at RegDesk. And if you're familiar with RegDesk, we are an AI-powered regulatory management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. And our platform allows RA teams to prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. If you want to learn more about our platform, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to show you a demo or give you some more information about how we can help you with your medical device regulations. To focus on you for a minute, we truly appreciate you being here today. We know you have lots of ways that you can spend your time, and we appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us. So the way the webinar will work is we will have our presenter go, and I'll introduce him in just a minute. And then the last 5 to 10 minutes, we will save that for Q&A. So as we're going through this, if you have any questions, either drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll pull all of those and try to get through as many of those as we can. If we have any left over, we will make sure that when we send out the slide deck and presentation, that we send this out to you. So you will get that as well. And then we're going to have a couple minutes at the end, right before the Q&A, where we have our VP of Regulatory, Jody Granger from RegDesk, and she's just going to go over some new exciting release information for our 5.1 release we just had and share some of the top features that we've added into that. So I think you'll be really excited to see that as well. Today, we're excited to dive into EU IVDR requirements with our expert, Lee Westwood. He is the founder and principal consultant at QRA Consulting Proprietary Limited. Lee brings nearly 20 years of experience in regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and clinical data management. He's a trusted subject matter in medical devices and IVDs, and assists manufacturers globally with things like global regulatory strategies, EU IVDR and MDR compliance, APAC and America's regulatory requirements, and TGA sponsor services for the Australian market. We are so excited you can be here with us today, Lee. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you get started.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Gay. It's my pleasure to be here again. This is my second presentation webinar for RegDesk, and I think these are fantastic opportunities for us regulatory people and quality people to get together and hopefully learn something new. And it's my pleasure to be here with you today. Like Gay's already said, my name is Lee Westwood, the principal consultant and founder of QRA Consulting. I'm based here in Western Australia, so it's 10 p.m. for me. It's well past my bedtime, but it's worth it to stay up here and talk to you guys. So I'll skip through this since Gay's done a really good job in introducing me. And I'll talk about today's agenda. It's a topic that is dear to my heart, I have to say. I like working with the IVDR. I've been involved with it since around 2017 to some degree, learning the requirements, which has not always been easy, but it's been an enjoyable journey. So today I want to talk to you about the 3 pillars of clinical evidence. I call them pillars, but the 3 aspects of clinical evidence that the IVDR requests of you, that you have to obliges you to present. We're going to talk about clinical evidence, which is commensurate to the risk of your device. State of the art. Now, if you've read the regulation, you will have read state of the art around 20 plus times. But I want to give you the practical implementation of state of the art and try and define that a little bit easier and better for you guys, so you understand exactly what the regulation is asking of you in that regard. We're going to have a look at some clinical study requirements, essentially the different style or different types of studies that can be conducted under the IVDR and when you need to have a clinical study. And then one thing that the IVDR is so heavy on is the documentation requirements. And I'm going to try and provide you an overview of those related to clinical evidence. The documents are outputs of processes, and I'm going to show you what outputs are required and also how they all interact with one another. Many of you are overseas, of course. We may have IVDs already with market authorization outside of the European Union. So we're going to look at what you can leverage for your market authorization applications in Europe. And also if you have a legacy device being a device which is CE marked currently under the IVDD, how we can leverage some of that work that you've already done for your clinical evidence to implement into your IVDR submission. And then we'll have a quick look at your ongoing clinical evidence obligations. So that's the post-market performance follow-up. So I'll describe what that is to you. But first, I think it's important that we talk about the some of the critical changes that have been implemented between the IVDD and the IVDR and how that impacts this presentation, but clinical evidence as a whole. So under the IVDD, the vast majority of devices were low risk class. So the risk classification was list A and list B, and then general IVDs, which captured everything else. Now, only the list A and list B required notified body involvement, so pre-market approval, before all the other devices could be self-certified and placed on the market. The IVDR has flipped that entirely. So now the risk classification is A through D, with A being the lowest risk class, so that's to your self-certified devices, things like accessories with no critical functions, and class D being your highest risk class. That's devices that are used for blood grouping, HIV testing, things of that nature. So B, C, and D all require notified body involvement and all require clinical evidence to be presented. The intended purpose, of course, under the IVDD, you had your intended use statement, which there was no obligation or documented requirements on what you needed to include in that statement. So you could be pretty vague with how you describe your device, and particularly around the scientific validity or the clinical utility or the clinical claim that you're making with your device. That's changed under the IVDR. There's now very specific requirements where you talk about the type of device, the analyte, the sample, and critically the clinical condition or physiological state in which your analyte is associated. So it's providing a real clinical intended purpose for your IVD. Now that is incredibly important when it comes to your performance evaluation and designing your clinical evidence strategies. Performance evaluation and post-market surveillance are the two biggest changes, in my opinion. Yes, there's a lot of changes. The IVDD was just a directive. Now we have a regulation, which is law, legislation, and it's significantly more detailed. But performance evaluation is something the notified bodies are paying particular attention to, and there's a lot of mandatory documentation deliverables that you have to produce. Post-market surveillance is a beast in its own and could be its own webinar. I've included it in here to a degree because of the post-market performance follow-up, which we'll talk about. But that is a significant change from the IVDD in that there's a lot more data sources that you need to consider. But we're going to focus on the performance evaluation today. So the three pillars of clinical evidence, what are they? So the IVDR requires you to demonstrate the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance of your device. Now, I'm going to talk about each of these pillars in a little bit more detail. This is just a definition slide, but the scientific validity is the association of an analyte with a clinical or physiological state. The analytical performance is the ability, you're demonstrating the ability of your device to correctly detect or measure a particular analyte. And I take that one step further and say consistently and accurately. And then the clinical performance is the ability of your device to yield results that correlate to the particular clinical condition or physiological state in accordance with the intended target population, the intended user, in the intended use environment. So it's essentially validating your intended purpose in the intended use environment. So let's have a little look, first of all, at scientific validity. Now, I apologize, this is a rather text-heavy slide, but I'll summarize it briefly for you. The most important thing to take away from what scientific validity is it is not an assessment of your device. Okay, your device is not subject to this process. This is purely an assessment of the analyte or documenting that there is a correlation between the analyte that your device is designed to measure or detect or screen for and a clinical or physiological state. It is not in any way an assessment of your device. So how do we do this? There's a number of ways you can do it. If it's a novel device or a novel analyte, I should say, you can use concept and feasibility studies, right? And you can use studies that have been conducted by research organizations or expert opinions out there on the market. The vast majority of devices, at least in my experience, have peer-reviewed literature out there around the correlation between the analyte and the physiological condition. So it's a systematic, very important, systematic review of peer-reviewed literature demonstrating the scientific validity of your device. It has to be systematic. You cannot just pick papers at will, because one of the key factors is you've got to avoid company bias. It's very tempting, I guess, to find favorable papers and disregard ones that kind of call into question your scientific validity. So how do you avoid bias? My recommendation is to outsource this process. So find a consultancy in Europe, there's several, or around the world, a specialist that can do this. By getting someone else to do it, you document in your performance documentation that you've avoided bias in that regard. But how else do you do it? So it's a systematic approach in your performance evaluation plan, which is, in my opinion, probably the most important document in your technical documentation. You identify your process about how you're going to do this literature search. You'll also have a protocol, your search results, a search report, culminating in your scientific validity report. And it's important that your protocol has inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. You're going to list which journals you're going to look for, which search engines, like PubMed, for example, you're going to look at, and what particular focus on your inclusion and exclusion criteria and how you avoid bias. So scientific validity is demonstrating that there is a documented, well-documented correlation between your analyte and a physiological condition which comes from your intended purpose. Now, I normally recommend to do this early in a design control project if you're developing a new device. The reason being, if there's no scientific validity, chances are you don't have a device, unless you've got a very low risk class device. So it's almost like a feasibility in a way. So this is something that we didn't have to worry about under the IVDD. What we did have to worry about under the IVDD was analytical performance. So this is the second pillar. And this is demonstrating that your device can consistently detect or measure the analyte that you claim in your intended purpose. It's always required analytical performance unless you have a low risk class A, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. But for B, C, and D, and even devices like software, you need to have analytical performance. Now, the IVDR gives you a list of analytical performance characteristics for you to consider. These are not new. These have been around from the IVDD days, the In Vitro Diagnostic Directive days. Trueness, precision, accuracy, your measuring range, limit detection, for example. When you're documenting your performance evaluation plan, so your performance evaluation plan is your document that's going to outline your strategy for gathering clinical evidence, ultimately to demonstrate your clinical benefit. You have to identify which performance characteristics are applicable to your device and which ones are not. Now, the ones that are not, you don't just leave out of your documentation, you justify why they are not. Now, why would the performance characteristics not be applicable to you? It depends on the type of device you have. For example, whether you have a qualitative device, a quantitative device, or a semi-quantitative device, the risk class of your device, but also whether it's an established and standardized test or if it's a novel test. So you've got to factor these in considering which performance characteristics are applicable to you. Analytical performance, the strategy is outlined in the performance evaluation plan, saying, okay, we're going to assess these analytical performance characteristics, and we're going to do so by this method, and we're going to assess these acceptance criteria. We're also not going to look at these analytical performance characteristics because. Then each study that you conduct will have an analytical performance study plan and an analytical performance study report. And when you've conducted all of your studies, all the results get summarized in what your APR, which is your analytical performance report. Now, notified bodies, this is one of the places where they've thrown in the terminology state of the art. They're looking to see that you considered the state of the art when you're doing your analytical testing. So what is state of the art in this context? State of the art is CLSI guidances when they're available. So in this slide, and I regret choosing green, it looks terrible, but nevertheless, the analytical performance characteristic you can see listed down the left-hand side, typical device type. Now, again, I say typical because the intended purpose could change this a little bit. that is applicable to that performance characteristic and a list of an example guidance to refer to when you're designing your internal or when you're designing your analytical performance study. Now, when you have a qualitative device, so like a binary, yes, no, present, positive, negative, there's not so many guidance to refer to. Most of these guidance are related to quantitative devices. However, you can still look at these guidances and take study designs best practice. You don't have to comply entirely to the guidance, but you just have to justify your approach in your performance evaluation plan. Now, you guys are going to get a copy of this presentation, so feel free to look through that and send me any questions if you have any around the guidances. But down the left-hand side here is all the analytical performance characteristics that I've come across. Some of them are not actually specified in the IVDR, but are expected. For example, metrological sample types and matrices, sample stability and handling, instrument equivalence, high dose of hook. These are all something that you should really consider when you're outlining your strategy for analytical performance. Now, I mentioned software. Um, Software gets handled the exact same way as an assay, an IVD assay, a diagnostic, in terms of the technical documentation that you need to develop for a performance evaluation. So you still have a performance evaluation plan, you still have an AP, a scientific validity paper, an APR, and clinical performance. But MDCG 2021 also encourages manufacturers to assess things like confidentiality, reliability, and usability engineering. Now, usability engineering in this analytical context is like the formative testing. So if you're familiar with the standard 63664 usability engineering, formative evaluation is what's considered analytical, and your subsequent summative evaluation is considered in the clinical performance. For an assay, usability engineer is considered outside of the performance evaluation. Don't know why. It's the way that the guidances have been written. Now, for Class A, scientific validity, analytical, and clinical performance might not always be relevant. For example, if you have a very low risk accessory with no critical features or functions, or you have an analyzer, scientific validity, analytical performance may be difficult to generate. But you still must generate performance evaluation, but focus it on a demonstration that the device works as you intend. So like a functional validation. And if you've got an analyzer or something like that, you want to make sure you consider things like the electrical regulations, which the European Union has plenty of, which you need to CE mark your device to. So just because it's a Class A device, you're not off the hook, but there is more justification you can have for not doing a full scientific validity, analytical, and clinical performance. Pillar 3 is the clinical performance. So this is, like I said, the validation of your intended purpose, essentially. And there's 3 ways. Really, there's 4, but there's 3 ways that's listed in the IVDR and how you can demonstrate your clinical performance evaluation. That's clinical performance studies, peer-reviewed literature, or published experience gained from routine diagnostic testing or real-world testing. I say there's really 4 because there's other sources of clinical evidence you can use. The IVDR is pretty good in that you don't have to throw away data that you have just because it doesn't comply necessarily with the documentation nomenclature or format of the IVDR. So if you've done studies under the IVDD and your IVDR device is identical, there's no change in intended purpose, for example, you can still use that data. But chances are your study documentation, especially if you've done it a long time ago, is not going to comply to the IVDR. But rather than rewriting it, right, which you don't have to do, MedTech's been quite clear on that, you can include that data as other sources of clinical evidence, and you just have to justify that. So you do a data appraisal and you justify its inclusion. But definitely the most robust clinical evidence you can provide is the clinical performance studies. But peer-reviewed literature is essentially the same process as your scientific validity process. In fact, if you have templates that you've implemented into your quality management system for scientific validity, I would use those for your literature gathering as well. It's a systematic approach, inclusion, exclusion criteria, all the same as the scientific validity, with one key difference. Peer-reviewed literature, you can only use papers or studies conducted by other by customers or by research organizations or published in journals, if they've used your device in accordance with your intended purpose. So that is a key inclusion criteria for using particular papers. Again, you have to avoid bias. So again, outsourcing this is not a bad idea. Um, Peer-reviewed literature, I think, is better as a supplementary um, demonstration of clinical evidence. I don't think that unless you've got absolute abundance of this, I don't think it's going to ever be enough on its own for IVDR certification. I may be wrong, but I don't believe so. I think it's typically used as supplemental, providing some extra evidence into your performance evaluation file. But that's the first method. The second is published experience gained. So this is real world data. Okay, so this is data that you gather on an already CE marked device. Now that is the critical point here. So if you're developing a new device from scratch for IVDR submission to get approval, you're not going to have published experience gained in regards to studies with a CE marked device or routine diagnostic testing on a CE marked device. Okay, but what you can do is if you've got a legacy device, which you're bringing to the IVDR, so again, so long as the devices are identical, PMPF processes are already applicable to IVDD devices. So you can run a PMPF study on your IVDD device to bolster your clinical evidence for IVDR submission. Okay, so there's various sources of published experience gained, which you can get. This PMPF plan, and I'm going to talk about that in a few slides time actually, but one of the most important things when it comes to published experience gained is there's certain criteria that it has to meet. Now, luckily, it's a fairly broad definition. So the info has to be publicly available, has to be announced formally. Okay, so there's an interpretation in that, and available upon request. So the single most important thing, in my opinion, is that the author has to be identifiable. So we can trace to the author, so we know who's written it and we can access the information, but also that the intended purpose has been reflected. Okay, so this is another way of gathering information after your device is CE marked to bolster your clinical evidence or to use it as part of your legacy device transition to the IVDR. But clinical performance studies is where it's at. Okay, so notified bodies are looking for clinical performance studies. Now, you can get away with not doing one if you have sufficient levels of other sources of clinical evidence, which is rare. So I would say if you've got the opportunity, you should always do a clinical study. And there's different types of clinical studies under the IVDR. And your study design is going to be reflective of the risk classification of your device and the intended purpose of your device, or whether it's a novel device. If it's a novel device, you're going to have some sort of clinical data demonstrating the clinical utility or the scientific validity of your device. But the first thing you want to do is identify what your performance characteristics of your device is going to be. So what your study endpoints are going to be. So from your intended purpose, say you've got a screening device, typical IVDR defined performance characteristic, clinical performance characteristic would be diagnostic sensitivity and specificity, or positive predictive value or negative predictive value. But the flip side of that, in order to have diagnostic sensitivity and specificity, you've got to have cutoffs. Cutoffs demonstrated analytically. So cutoffs are like medical decision points, which is very difficult to do. So they don't always fit, right? Clinical performance characteristics don't always fit your device. So again, in your performance evaluation plan, you're going to justify which performance characteristics are applicable to you, which are not, which definition are you changing slightly to fit your device, or whether you have your own definition, like a diagnostic accuracy, or just demonstrating a correlation with a physiological state is also possible. So risk classification, intended purpose, identifying what you need to demonstrate. This pyramid here is taken from the MedTech guidance document, one of many, which is a pyramid of the robustness of data. Okay, so the most robust data is your prospective studies. Okay, so long as you've got a statistically adequate sample, this generally provides you the highest yield or the strongest robust clinical performance data. Now, this is recommended for your novel devices and your very high risk devices. If you go down this route of a prospective study, a whole bunch of IVDR articles become applicable to you, and that's around the control of the study. So the higher the risk of the study, the more risk to subjects or patients involved in the study, the more control, more reporting conditions, um, competent authority approvals, things like that you need to go through. I'll talk about that a little bit. The next level is retrospective clinical performance. So that's like leftover samples or biobank, some blood bank samples. Um, Again, suitable for novel and established devices. Less hoops to jump through when you're designing and getting your study conducted. And then you move down the pyramid down to indirect performance. So that direct performance evaluation is an actual assessment using your device, whereas indirect is like a comparison with a reference device internally. Just, you could do analytical testing and say, oh, we perform the same as this device, therefore our clinical performance is the same. You can see why it goes down on the pyramid there. So depending on the study type that you end up with, whether it's prospective, interventional, non-interventional, interventional, of course, is when you have patient management decisions during the study. That will dictate the articles you have to comply with the IVDR, and it will dictate the conditions in which you have to conduct your study. So Article 57 applies to all, and that is your device must comply to the general safety and performance requirements of the IVDR, except those which are under assessment, of course. You have to ensure the ethical approval, so the dignity and the safety of participants. So even if it's leftover samples, there should still be some informed consent. Either it's a general informed consent to say that this lab can use leftover samples for validation purposes or research purposes, but there has to be something in place there. And of course, the GDPR in Europe, which is the data protection regulation, applies. Okay, so you have to make sure you document that in your study documentation. And then if it's a certain type of study, and that's what it's actually called, a certain type of study, you can see that Article 57, 58, 59, all the way through to 77 apply. And if you read those, you'll see, okay, so it's quite difficult to run a study like this. But critical in your study planning, no matter if it's a prospective or interventional or non-interventional, no matter your study plan, use ISO 20916, clinical performance studies using specimens from human subject. That is the gold standard, the state of the art for running clinical studies using IVDs. In fact, when you apply for your IVDR approval, especially for the German notified bodies, they have a tick box. Did you use ISO 20916? It's that important. And it's important because it's actually set up to align with the IVDR requirements on certain studies. So from this flow chart here, you can see which elements of ISO 20916 apply to your study's type. So you can see if you have an interventional study, all those annexes apply, and you have to comply with all those annexes. Whereas if you have leftover samples and there's no patients involved, it's far more straightforward. So keep that in mind when you're documenting your studies. And 21916 has all the requirements for study planning, ethical approvals, document requirements, reporting requirements, study monitoring, everything that you need to run a study in the European Union is covered in ISO 21916 in those articles I just mentioned before. So clinical evidence as a whole, scientific validity, analytical performance, clinical performance, is all geared towards demonstrating the clinical benefit of your device. Now, for an IVD, the clinical benefit rarely is always around providing accurate medical information to a clinician. It's rarely the subsequent treatment on the information that clinicians get. So focus your clinical benefit around demonstrating your device's ability to measure and annulate with correlated physiological state or clinical condition accurately, consistently in accordance with the state of the art, and this is your clinical benefit. Clinical benefit gets described in the performance evaluation report, which is the final document of the performance evaluation process, but it feeds into your risk management process. And that's where you come up with your benefit versus risk assessment. And I have a flow chart coming up to show you a little bit more about that. But again, ISO 20916 discusses clinical benefit in a bit more detail, but it's an important point, and it's what a notified body wants to see. How you define the clinical benefit of the device, and has the clinical evidence that you've generated supported your conclusion on the clinical benefit. So clinical evidence commensurate to risk. You can see Class A is not on here at all. Like I said before, scientific validity, analytical and clinical performance is not always applicable, but you can see the steady incline here. Okay, so for Class D devices, the highest risk class, substantially more emphasis is put on the clinical performance. A little bit less, but a little bit more than scientific validity and analytical for Class Cs, and rather even Stevens for Class Bs. So this is a good guide to use when you say, do I have enough clinical evidence for my risk class of my device? State of the art. So I've said it a few times now, but what does it actually mean? So there's been a number of definitions that I've read, but I've paraphrased a little bit here, but this is essentially how it's understood. State of the art in medicine is currently defined as the accepted best practice and current gold standard or standard of care within your intended purpose. So whether it's monitoring for kidney disease or monitoring for, whatever it may be, you have to define what the current standard of care is, what the current gold standard is, and where your device fits into that gold standard. Okay, so if it's the same, if it's another device within the same standard of care, okay, great. If it's pushing the envelope a little bit, great. If you're lagging behind the curve, then you're going to have a bit of a problem getting it through the notified body review. Likewise, the state-of-the-art performance. This is a demonstration that your device performs as other state-of-the-art devices that have been identified, other gold standard devices. Does your device perform as good as or better than these other devices? Again, if your performance is lacking a little bit, you're going to have a bit of a problem there getting it through the notified body. It is not state of the art does not mean the most technologically advanced device. It's got nothing to do with technology, so keep that in mind. But state of the art also refers to the use of standards and guidance. Throughout the IVDR, it talks about in accordance with state of the art. So reduce risk as far as possible in accordance with the state of the art. So what does that mean? It means ISO 14971, 2019. Analytical performance CLSI guidances. Okay, so it's using the guidance or the standards or the regulations that are in place and considered state of the art. So you have to use these, or if you don't use them, you have to justify your reasons why. Okay, and how do you document state of the art? I always recommend to create a report which covers everything that we've just spoken about, which you can then reference in your performance evaluation documentation. Again, outsourcing is not a bad idea to avoid company bias. And then recording of standards and guidances you will do throughout your performance, throughout your entire technical documentation, in fact, anyway. So you don't need to add that to your state-of-the-art report. Your state-of-the-art report should focus on state-of-the-art in medicine, state-of-the-art in performance, and where your device fits into that curve. Now, I promise you an overview of the documents, and I hope you can all see this okay. These are the mandated document deliverables, okay? So you start with your intended purpose. This is input into everything. Your performance evaluation plan provides your strategy for analytical performance, scientific validity, and clinical performance. Within here, you've also got your analytical performance study plans and reports, culminating in your analytical performance report. Likewise, your scientific validity related documents ending up with your SVR. Your performance evaluation plan describes your strategy for your clinical performance assessment, and then you generate a clinical performance study plan in accordance with ISO 21916, culminating in your CPR, your clinical performance report, all of which is then described in your performance evaluation report, which is a live document, concludes your clinical benefit, and also links to your post-market performance evaluation process. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to spend too much time going over this, but if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I haven't discussed the SSP or things like that in this presentation. The important point to reflect on here is PEP, APR, SVR, CPR, PER. Okay? These are mandatory documents that you have to provide unless you have a Class A document device. Leveraging overseas data. So you can do this, right? If you have studies that have been run in the US, for example, and you want to use it in Europe, you can use it so long as the target population, so the population that the study was ran on in the US is equivalent to the European population, okay? Or wherever you've run your studies. Document that. Do a data appraisal to say, yes, the study is relevant to the European Union. If so, you don't have to rewrite it. You don't have to do a bridging study. You need to do a bridging study if there are gaps in the target population, or if you haven't got the local ethics or local legislative requirements have not been met. The IVDR will check that. So again, you can use the data, use it as other sources of clinical evidence, and describe that in your performance evaluation plan. Legacy data devices I've kind of spoken about already. Okay, so for your analytical performance and your clinical performance, I've developed this flow chart, which is based on something that MedTech put together for published experience gained. But essentially, you want to check that the data that you've generated for your legacy device is still reflective of the device you're putting through the IVDR. Was it done using a suitable method, a state-of-the-art method? Was there enough samples used? Okay, was the conclusions correct? Have you got all the raw data and data integrity is being maintained? If you have, you can use it. That's great. If not, you might need to consider doing additional clinical, analytical or clinical studies. Okay, but you don't have to update them just for the terminology purposes of the IVDR if the data is sufficient. The PMPF process. So once you've CE marked your device, you've got your clinical evidence, it's not the end of the story. Okay, you've got to continuously update through your post-market performance follow-up process. This is proactively collecting and evaluating the performance of your device, changing state-of-the-art, relative scientific data, and continuously feeding that into your performance evaluation. The best way to do that is through post-market performance follow-up studies. So that's conducting a study on your CE mark device. I recommend doing that once every 2 years or so. Use a different device to compare yours against, reinforce your clinical evidence. Okay, so this is a process that feeds into your ongoing benefit assessment and your risk assessment. I'll run in a little bit low on time, so I'll skip over that one and I'll show you this overview. Post-market surveillance and PMPF process, link to your performance evaluation report. Update as soon as possible or when you have predefined triggers that update your performance evaluation report. It's absolutely critical. You keep these documents up to date and live. Notified bodies are going to be looking for that. So just to summarize, okay, 3 pillars of clinical evidence: scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. Use the state-of-the-art, assess the intended purpose, assess the performance characteristics that are going to be applicable to your device, and make sure that you continuously update your clinical evidence even after you have CE marking. Okay, and I think that's all I have time for, and I shall leave it there. But I know that Jody has a couple of slides here that she would like to discuss with everybody.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'll keep my 2 slides short and sweet so we can jump into questions. We're just routinely being asked, what are the innovations that RegDesk is currently working on in terms of our RIM platform. So I just wanted to highlight some of those for you all today. We just did a software version release. It is our 5.1 release. And some of the key things that were included is a complete redesign of our change assessment module. This module is intended to allow medical device manufacturers, whether that be IVDs or standard medical devices, to ensure that for every change they are trying to implement on a product that's already been approved, that those assessments can be done globally. And any regulatory impact that is identified, that you're able to execute on those changes all within the platform itself. What we have found, and you can see that through warning letters and other audit findings that are out in the public forum, is that many manufacturers are really good about making assessments in primary markets, US, EU, everybody's got that down pretty well. But where it gets complicated is when you start selling your products to, all the rest of world markets, 50 markets. And it's really important that you have documented assessments in every single place where you sell. Many people utilize distributors. So you have distributors in these other countries who own the licenses, and ultimately it is up to them to be involved in the assessment process. So this redesign module will allow you to do all of that, seamlessly, and be able to provide regulatory authorities documentation to prove that those assessments were done and actions taken as needed. So that is the change control module. We're happy if anyone's interested in that module to provide a demo to give you more detail. In addition, we have launched an AI translation tool for the various, you can use it for any document, but essentially we primarily implemented it for new laws that are released. So one of the big challenges is, of course, is if a law is only published in the native language in Chinese or Portuguese, it's very difficult for folks at corporate levels who only speak English to be able to review that law and understand, do we need to take action or not? So our translation tool is developed a little differently than if you tried to do the same thing in Google Translate, where you put the document in and you'll get an output, in a particular language. Our tool is designed in such a way that the native language is retained and the formatting of the document is also retained. So you're keeping the spirit of the document as it was written by the regulatory authority and being able to put that in a language that you can understand. There's 50 languages currently available. This will let you easily put those documents in so that you can ensure that you are complying with the requirements. Another benefit of being able to have these translated versions is that, especially if you're working with distributors, you want to make sure that you can kind of cross-check the requirements that they may be communicating to you, and make sure that it truly is something that is being required by the law and not just something that, maybe these, third parties that you're dealing with are wanting to have. So it just kind of helps you make those assessments on an ongoing basis. The last item is in regards to our regulatory intelligence. RegDesk, of course, was founded with regulatory intelligence. That's the foundation of our entire platform, is making sure that we understand what the requirements are for IVDs and medical devices across the globe. We utilize regulatory professionals for our regulatory intelligence. This is not something that's being done by AI, which I think is a big distinction between some of the other regulatory intelligence platforms out there. We're constantly adding new attributes in our regulatory intelligence wheel. So we've added RoHS and REACH requirements, along with, I think we have 10 new tiles in our regulatory intelligence that's being launched with the 5.1 version. Next slide, please. And my closing comment, and this will be in the slide, you can look at it, at your leisure, but I just wanted to be sure that those joining us today understand that RegDesk is really looking to provide solutions to all of your regulatory processes. So whether they fall into the beginning of the process or the end, we want to make sure that we can provide tools to you. So we've broken that down really into 4 key pillars or categories of the life cycle. There's the planning piece, which will include our regulatory intelligence, daily regulatory alerts, standards management, etc. So this is where you're trying to develop your regulatory strategies. What do I need to do? What do the laws tell me I need to submit? The second is our build. This is where you can actually create your submissions within the tool. If you build a baseline submission like your EU Tech Doc or your US submission, you can easily leverage that with our AI technology to then populate automatically submissions in our customized templates for every other country. So the building piece is really where you get a lot of return on investment in terms of being able to not manually cut and paste pieces of submissions from one to another, but have that automated within the tool. The next is tracking. We're always having to report out, where do we have our products approved? What submissions are in flight? Where do I have renewals, etc. So our tracking module will allow you to have that source of truth for all of your entire product portfolio within the system, and you can easily run customized reports to be able to provide details to other stakeholders. And then the maintain side is where our change assessment module comes in. And also we have a document comparison tool that is almost ready for launch. It's in going toward validation here shortly, where if a standard is changed or a law is changed from one version to another, you'll be able to easily get a report out of everything that has changed between those versions so that you can more easily make an assessment. It takes a long time for regulatory professionals to read every single line of a law or of a standard that's being modified just to figure out what has been changed. So this tool will help you do that more effectively. So that's really the last of my slides. So I'll kick it over to you, Gay, so that you can go through any questions that we received, and I'll let Lee field those questions.
All right, perfect. Thanks for sharing that about RegDesk. It makes me so excited to work here with all the innovation we have. So thanks for that, Jody. And Lee, thank you so much for sharing all the information. We know that it's so hard for us to sometimes understand these complex issues, and you really break it down well. And I know it's super late there, so we appreciate you hanging in here with us for just a few more minutes to get some
No
questions
problem.
answered. We
Sure.
have a question that says, well, first they say, thank you for talking about this very important topic. And then how do you ensure your clinical performance is properly demonstrated for IVD software products?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Software products, like I said earlier, there's no distinction between assays and software when it comes to the performance evaluation. Where there is differences is in the use of state of the art. So using IC 62304, 82304 to generate your internal verification testing, software architecture, and things like that, which gets included in your technical documentation. But for an analytical performance, for example, if the software, typically the analytical performance reports for the software and the analytical performance report for the assay will have quite a lot of overlap, but they will be different. All right. So even if you've got an assay that works with a software, you're going to have 2 different technical documentation, one for the assay, one for the software. Now you're going to cover most of the performance characteristics together, right? Because it's a requirement to. It's a requirement to demonstrate the performance of the assay in conjunction with any other device that it's used with, in this case, the software. But you do also have to consider other analytical performance characteristics. Likewise for the clinical performance, okay? So you should be running your clinical performance study, the software with the assay, right? And for conditions when they're a combined product. But again, you're going to have a separate performance evaluation report at the end of the day, but you can combine the CPR, so the clinical performance report of the software and the assay, because ideally you're going to do one study and it's going to be one study in conjunction with one another. Okay, so you do need to consider the software as its own device. That's what the regulations are set up for. but there will be quite a lot of overlap with the assay. Now, if it's a standalone software, it comes down to the intended purpose again. What is the intended purpose of this software if it's not using an assay at all? And how do you demonstrate that intended purpose? And the critical feature is to do it with an intended users in an intended use environment and really validate that intended purpose and the clinical benefit that you claim your device has. So again, the same requirements apply to software as they do for the assay. I hope that.
Okay, and I think I might have interrupted you. Were you finished with
No,
what
I
you
was
were
saying I
saying, or
hope
did
that
you have a
helps.
little more?
No, I hope that helps. That's all.
Okay, I'm sure that helps. Okay, a couple more. Could you explain in more detail the clinical benefit of an IVD?
Yes, so that's another good question. One of the important things to do is when you're setting up your performance evaluation plan, you have to predefine your acceptance criteria. Okay, so what is your acceptance criteria in terms of benefit, clinical benefit for your scientific validity, your analytical performance, and clinical performance? Typically, the acceptance criteria for your benefit assessment, clinical benefit, is that there is a strong correlation between the analyte and the physiological condition. Analytical is that your device is consistent and provides accurate medical information, which is critical for the clinician that's going to use this data. And then clinically, you're going to prove that your device works within the intended purpose just as well as the gold standard or better of what exists. Or if it's a novel device, that you demonstrate that your device performs as you need it to for a clinician. And they all feed into your input into your benefit assessment. Now, you also consider things like usability engineering. Is the device safe to use? Was there any unidentified risks that came up through the performance evaluation that you hadn't considered before? So that gets input into your benefit assessment. Turnaround time, availability, market authorization. These are all benefit. But you distinguish your clinical benefit in your performance evaluation report. That feeds into your risk management report, where you will finalize your benefit versus risk assessment. I should say as well, when you do your clinical benefit assessment in the performance evaluation report, you should have an expert, whether it be someone with extensive knowledge in the field, the clinical field, or it could be someone in the field that doesn't work for your company. Whoever it is, you just justify and they add their signature to say, yes, I think this has clinical benefit because. But it's ultimately predefining your acceptance criteria, demonstrating your device meets that acceptance criteria and therefore has a positive input into your benefit versus risk assessment. So it's a good question, and there's quite a lot of examples out there for clinical benefit assessments. If you look at medtech guidances, for example, that spell this out quite well, and ISO 21916 considers benefit as well.
Okay, perfect. And if anybody, obviously, as we're talking through this, if you have additional questions, please reach out to us if they don't get answered today. Another question we have is, do you notice common shortfalls in documentation that notified bodies are rejecting in their reviews?
Yes, it's a short answer. And the expanded answer is they actually released Team Notified Body, which is the notified bodies get together and they moan about everything. And they actually released the most common shortfalls, and inconsistent intended purpose statements throughout the documentation is one of their big no-nos. Even if it's just slightly worded differently, it has to be consistent throughout. Missing key deliverables. So your performance evaluation plan, performance evaluation report, APR, CPR, all these documents you got to have in place. And not considering all the analytical performance characteristics that should be applicable to your device. So if it's a measuring device, you would expect to have limit of detection, limit of quantification, limit of blank, the measuring intervals, the whole everything related to a measuring device. Quite often, manufacturers are just identifying one or two or three, and then not addressing the performance characteristics that they deem not applicable to their device. The notified body is going to send a question straight away. And that if they don't reject your application, they're going to send it back to you. But the most common reason for technical files being rejected, as in they won't even proceed with the review, is missing documentation. All right, so make sure you complete the checklist before you submit your file. Every notified body has a checklist that says, and you go through Annex 2 and Annex 3 of the IVDR, which talks about exactly what documentation you need to cover, or which areas, what elements you have to cover, and check off that you've got everything that you need. Otherwise, they'll just send it back to you. So consistency, deliverables are all in place, and addressing what's not applicable to your device, not just dismissing it. Those are the most common ones that I think manufacturers are notified bodies are dealing with at the moment.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. Let's just get through this one, and if we have any more, we'll share those when we send out the slide deck and record it. Is infrastructure in EU improving and adopting IVDR as efficiently as anticipated?
No. Well, that's not fair. Let's just say they were very ambitious with their original timelines. Okay, so they, 2022 was the go live date, if you will. 2017 it was implemented, but 2022 was the kill switch for the IVDD. But they were lacking considerably. They'd overstretched the regulation. The amount of devices that had to go through a notified body review went up to about 95% of all devices. At the time, there was only 6, I think, designated notified bodies. There's a few more now. There were no reference labs, which you need for a Class D device. There's a few more of those now. There was no guidance documents. So they are slowly improving. But things like UDAMED. So UDAMED is the database, which is going to be, there's 6 modules. It's going to be used for clinical performance study tracking, registering your device, maintaining your certificates and vigilance and things like that. That's still not ready, right? But they're now in this position where they're saying, okay, we're going to roll out UDAMED. So you're going to start using it as modules become available. We'll tell you about that soon. And we're still waiting for information on that. So yes, I think things are getting better, but they underestimated the impact of the IVDR on the industry, and they weren't ready for it at the time. But to their credit, they are introducing reforms. They're trying to make things more simpler and streamlined, and I think we're getting there. And we're seeing that turnaround times at notified bodies, which are painfully slow, depending on your notified body, do seem to be speeding up a little bit. So we're getting there. We're getting there, but there's some lessons to be learned in the industry in Europe, I think.
Yeah, I think that is very, very true what you're saying, and I appreciate your take on that. I know you have such in-depth knowledge about everything, and we can tell you're very passionate about this. So we
I
do
am.
appreciate you taking time today to share with us. That was our last question that we have time for. So again, to everybody that has attended today, we thank you very much for spending your time with us. We will send out the slide deck and the presentation and recording after this, so be on the lookout for that by the end of the week. And Lee, again, thank you. You have been, provided such valuable information for us. And I love a lot of our webinars make topics that are so complex very easy to understand. So appreciative of you taking the time and making this topic but in bite-sized pieces for us, so we can hopefully do better when we need to get medical devices approved in different countries. And Jody,
No
thanks for
problem.
sharing a little bit more about RegDesk with everyone. If you are interested in learning more about RegDesk, please reach out to us. We'd love to share the new CCP module. We had one of our customers recently say if they designed the CCP module, it was exactly how they would have designed it. So I think the team has done a great job. And again, thank you, Lee, and thank you, Jody, for your time today. And thank you, everyone that has attended.
Thank
Everybody
you very
have a
much.
great day.
Thank you.